Hello, my name is Selene Rodriguez. I'm the Assistant Director of Federal Affairs at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Today, I'm talking to my friend and colleague, Rodney Scott, who has over 3 decades of experience in the United States Border Patrol, his last few years being chief under both the Biden and Trump administrations. Rodney is now the Senior Fellow for Border Security at TPPF, and today we're going to be talking to you about the new Texas Marine Barrier System that consists of buoys along the Rio Grande. So Rodney, thank you for talking to me today. According to Texas DPS, I want to say that they've said the floating barrier consists of 4-foot wide buoys that spin when grabbed, and it is designed to be moved and extended if necessary. The buoys will have galvanized steel fixtures and rotating radial passive blades affixed between the buoys, which will prevent human smugglers from crossing under the blades and rotating them. If I'm not mistaken, this isn't a new idea. This was proposed, I believe, by the Army Corps of Engineers in 2020 when you were in the Border Patrol. So if you could give us some more information on that and what you thought about the buoy system when it was first proposed.
Sure. So you hit the nail on the head. This is nothing new. I want to talk about barriers real quick and then the buoy barriers specifically. Barriers as part of a security plan are basic to law enforcement. Barriers in border security go back even beyond my career. And we were constantly evolving and trying to make sure we're giving the American taxpayer the best return on their investment. But the idea behind it is it just slows down illegal activity and it allows 1 or 2 agents to be able to cover much wider area, if you will. Now, specific to the buoy barriers, and we're talking about Texas right now, but there are other areas where they're usable as well. One of the areas that we looked at using it initially was, believe it or not, on the coast of California. There's a short surf fence that goes out into the water, but we were looking at ways to extend that barrier for a couple of reasons. But the number one reason, and people miss this all the time, is to save lives, especially in the marine environment. So there's a little bit more than the Army Corps recommended to this. When I was the chief of the Border Patrol, one of my division chiefs who was in charge of these types of infrastructure projects was actually out at a vendor's site looking at some proposals for different types of specialty barriers that we were putting in very rocky areas. And then basically he saw a display and they started talking about, hey, how do you guys use these buoy barriers? And they talked about they're traditionally used more in a military environment to protect ships from small craft coming in, like the cold type attack. But they're also used to defend Navy bases, if you will, from swimmers or whatever else, but it's a barrier on the water. So they started looking at the feasibility, and then we decided to do actual tests. And again, this goes back to the Trump administration. We got the buoy barrier, we tested it in a pool type environment, then we deployed it in specific areas along the border, and we ran what we call like red team testing against it. We had some of our special BORTAC guys, if you know what they are, but if you're not familiar with Border Patrol, basically SWAT team guys, basically try to defeat the barrier. And we decided that it was pretty darn effective. And the company actually made some adjustments to it. And we were looking at deploying that specifically, again, off the coast of California, but in the Rio Grande River for a couple of different reasons. But again, the number one reason that people miss this is to save lives. By having the deterrent in the river itself, that's going to keep a lot of people from actually entering the river in the first place that don't really understand those currents. But a tactic the smugglers use in South Texas in the Rio Grande River, specifically around RGV and Laredo, that doesn't get a lot of attention is literally every time Border Patrol or GPS tries to take down one of those boats, the smugglers that are bringing people across in rafts and stuff, they throw a little kid or a woman or someone in the water. They do it very intentionally to switch from being an enforcement action to a rescue action. That distracts the agents. They go into rescue mode. And then even if a lot of the aliens or the narcotics get seized, the smugglers get away almost every single time. So we were looking at how do we save lives? How do we prevent people from getting into this situation in the first place? And how do we stop these boats from being able to quickly enter the United States without putting the people on the boats at increased risk? And it's common to law enforcement. It's common, if you really think about it, let's prevent the crime instead of reacting to it afterwards. And that's what the buoy barriers allowed us to do. And again, we decided we were going to deploy these, but time ran out in the last administration. When the new administration came in, again, I was still the chief. They made it very clear that we were not doing any barriers. All wall construction stopped. This concept was actually briefed to the current secretary once, and he was pretty open to it at that time, but was quickly shut down, my understanding, by the administration that this just isn't something that they were going to do. And he never openly took a position on it.
I'd like to note that when I spoke with DPS, I spoke with Lieutenant Olivares, and he made it very clear that this is not just a standalone barrier. This is part of a 3-layer system that includes the box cars or the rail cars and the concertina wire, and then you have the marine barrier. So there's 3 layers there. And I would like for you to tell me why these measures are even necessary today. What was it that made Governor Abbott say yes to taking this next step that nobody really saw coming?
I believe he decided to take the next step because this administration continues to refuse to try to slow down the flow and the criminal activity going across the border. They won't even talk about the criminal elements associated with this mass migration. The governor has done more than any other state, way more than the federal government, to try to protect all of America by stopping this criminal activity. Because all those guys on the river, whether they happen to be wearing a Texas DPS uniform or a Border Patrol uniform, or even some of the guard personnel, you very quickly understand that the mass illegal immigration is kind of cover, if you will. It distracts law enforcement. They are intentionally used by the cartels to bring in other very, very serious threats, like fentanyl, different types of narcotics, criminal aliens, terrorists, anybody that's willing to pay more to be in this second wave of people or things that comes across after law enforcement has been overwhelmed. Not to mention just literally the impact on all these small communities on the border of the mass migration. The governor is stepping up and he's doing everything he can to try to stop that. There's another piece to this, though. If you talk to Chris or others in Texas DPS, they'll tell you not every drowning is tracked, but there's been a significant increase in drownings just statistically because so many more people are trying to cross the river. So another reason you're doing that 3-layer barrier is to try to create a deterrent to ensure that people see this isn't an open door. This is going to be hard. And most people, especially if they're not super confident swimmers, are going to say, yeah, I don't think so. I'm going to go somewhere else. And they're going to stop using that smuggling. So this is a life and death issue to actually save people's lives, counter to what you're hearing in the public. And then you need but by having the 3 layers, that sends a stronger message. And then the 4th layer that I'm sure the lieutenant meant to throw in there is actually having personnel on the border right there, watching, monitoring, and then apprehending anybody that comes across. If those people that came across were actually prosecuted and deported immediately, this entire problem would go away. Unfortunately, that's the piece of the process that Texas doesn't really have the ability to do, because the immigration enforcement is a federal responsibility and the federal government keeps letting a lot of these people go. And that's why it keeps continuing.
I know in 2022, Eagle Pass had a really big problem in that area of the Rio Grande where they were having so many bodies that they were finding, specifically that were victims to drowning, that they were taking in 1 or more bodies a day and had a mobile morgue basically because they just couldn't identify all of the bodies that they were finding. So do you think that the barrier is going to help with problems like that and having less bodies, or do you think it's possible that we'll have the same or more possibly because of people getting trapped?
The way the barrier is designed is to be extremely visible. Well, when we were looking at deploying it, we were even looking at putting lights. We're doing all kinds of messaging. The governor's office has done a lot of messaging to make sure people know it's there. It's not something that's hidden under the water that could potentially catch someone off guard and create a drowning. The idea behind it is that it should and will long-term, again, I'll come back to that in a minute, will save lives because it's a highly visible deterrent that's going to keep people from entering the river in the first place. That barrier is in the middle of the river and or just onto the US side or onto the north part of the middle of the river. So you don't forget that literally a lot of those people, they weren't drowning right as they were exiting the river into the United States. They were drowning because they miscalculate the currents and they get just off of the shore, gets a little bit deeper. That's usually when we saw people get into distress. This barrier is going to prevent them, hopefully, from taking that very first step, and they'll save countless lives.
Growing up in Del Rio, I swam a lot in the Rio Grande. I kayaked in it. I've gone back and forth. Look at me, I'm in Mexico. But I can attest personally that it can be really dangerous to misread those currents. And before you know it, you're way further than you anticipated you'd be. So that's something I try to tell people. It's dangerous to cross it in the first place. And this is meant to be there to tell people not to do that. But moving on to my next question, this project was quickly met with a lot of legal pushback, which we know the governor and his team anticipated, starting with the kayaking business, which is kind of funny. And then, of course, as we knew what was coming, the Department of Justice. So because it's important, I want to read aloud that the Houston Chronicle wrote that the Environmental and Natural Resources Division of the U.S. Department of Justice sent a letter to Governor Abbott informing him that the state's actions violate federal law, raise humanitarian concerns, present serious risks to public safety and the environment, and may interfere with the federal government's ability to carry out its official duties. In the letter, they demanded that the state remove the barrier, which we didn't, and that followed with the lawsuit. So I'm from the border. I can say a lot about how hypocritical this sounds coming from the federal government, because we've seen how this crisis is molded by these policies. You have a lot more professional experience, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on what the letter said and the lawsuit.
So lawsuits, as we've seen, can be filed by anybody for any reason. But here's the truth of this one. The legal authority, because it's a Rio Grande River, there's treaties with Mexico, I would argue is a little bit of a gray area, and we're going to find out in court what the courts think. But the rest of what DOJ is trying to say is extremely hypocritical and factually incorrect in some areas. Again, as the chief of the Border Patrol, knowing the in-depth research that we went through before we started to go down this road, knowing the conversations we had about environmental impact, knowing how these buoy systems are used in other places where they've done systematic reviews of the environmental impact, the fact that it's not a permanent infrastructure. It can be expanded, it can be moved. It's literally, think about like a navigational buoy being put in the water. Their environmental arguments are extremely weak, but their operational arguments are a lie. Again, we looked at it, the Border Patrol agents looked at it, we looked at how we could use it and deploy it, and we were going to deploy it as the United States Border Patrol to help secure the border and save lives. None of that changed. The only thing that changed is the White House talking points that we no longer want barriers. None of their arguments, if you will, hold any water when it comes to evidence and actual operational impact. It just comes down to a political position that they don't like to see anything like this on the border that slows down illegal entry or slows down criminal activity. They've been very clear in their campaign. They've been very clear in the last 2 years by shutting down all border wall construction. This is just another one of their approaches, if you will. But any allegation that this hurts border enforcement is a flat out lie.
I'm glad you said that, because that's actually basically my next question. We've seen a lot of news articles come out lately saying or insinuating that Border Patrol field agents don't want the concertina wire, they don't want the buoys, that the things that Texas is doing is making their job harder, that they're getting in fights with DPS agents. I'm not there, I don't know, but you do know the general morale within Border Patrol. Do you think that the steps the state has taken do make their job harder, or do you think that they are more grateful that the state is doing things that they can't do anymore?
So I believe the steps that the federal government, the Biden administration, and specifically Secretary Mayorkas have taken, and the direction that they've given has made their job a lot more difficult and put them in extremely stressful, challenging situations where they're going head to head with Texas DPS. But on a personal level, I can tell you many conversations with those agents before any of this happened, just 30 years in the Border Patrol, part of my family, part of my bloodline. And then talking to a lot of guys since then, they greatly appreciate that Texas is stepping in and doing what they were hired to do, but they're being prevented from doing. The challenge is this. So you saw recently where Border Patrol agents basically went down and kind of opened some gates. So they cut concertina wire that Texas had put in to basically allow people into, or in one case to basically rescue somebody because they were already kind of stuck in it. That creates clash points, because once the person is inside the United States and Border Patrol is there, they have to do something about it. They have to take custody of them. They're being directed to not try to deter people. That's the big difference. Used to, we could yell at people, tell them to go back, try to deter their entry. We literally tracked them. We called it TBS, turned back south. This administration has basically completely gone away from deterrence, but deterrence is a big part of public safety. You want to deter the crime before it happens, not just react after. That's how they're hardwired. So the morale is tanked, but it's not because of what Texas is doing. It's because of what the federal government is doing.
I like what you just said, that the federal government is not taking those initial steps. So now Texas has been forced to react. And I think that's very important. These aren't things that the governor wakes up and says, I want to add something new on the border today. We've just kind of been forced to do these things. So clearly Governor Abbott anticipated all of these legal battles and everything that's coming up now. But if you could right now say one thing to Governor Abbott, what would you say?
I would keep up the fight, and remember, don't get sucked into the dialogue that this is about immigration, because it's really not. And anybody watching this, please remember, you're seeing illegal immigration, but that is not the threat specifically. That is a threat. The threat is that chaos of illegal immigration allows the cartels to do behind the scenes, to bring in anything they want into the United States, for nation states to sneak things into this country. All the criminal activity that goes on behind the scenes, the Border Patrol is not able to respond to then, because they're being overwhelmed with this mass illegal immigration. The governor of Texas gets it. So Governor Abbott, thank you. Keep up the fight. We're here with you. But everybody else out there needs to understand that the governor is really protecting all of America right now. And we should be waking up and actually supporting him. It's the federal government that's walked away from their responsibility. And I'll be doing everything I can to help support the state's position in this lawsuit and anything else going forward that provides border security.
Rodney, is there anything else that you think everyday Americans and people in Texas need to know about the buoy barrier before they go and they read all of these crazy articles like Beto O'Rourke's recent one saying how all we're doing is hating immigrants and killing them and killing babies? What is something that you want people to know about the buoys?
So whether it's the buoy barrier or the border wall, it's basically just like your own property and home. Just think of it as a fence around your yard. It's a delineation of the border, and it's a highly visible deterrent to illegal activity. There's nothing inherently wrong with the buoys, and literally all we're asking people to do is come through our front door and come through it legally. It is not legal for anyone to cross the border into the United States in between the ports of entry. Don't get sucked up in the rhetoric. Just think of it basically as your home. Hey, this is a security perimeter. It just happens to be water. So we found a different type of fence, a different type of barrier for the water than we had on the land, but it's the same exact concept. And this is all about nationality. Don't get sucked into this racism or discriminatory dialogue whatsoever. It's okay to be an American, and it's okay to have national borders and boundaries. That's how the world just works. And we don't care what country you're from, what nationality you are, what color you are. It is illegal to enter our country without coming through the front door.
That is all the questions I have today, but thank you for sharing your thoughts. And if there's anything else, I'm sure we'll contact you.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm here and ready to provide whatever information I can. And just thank you, all the people out there watching this, for taking the time, hopefully to learn a little bit more. And if you have specific questions, please get them to us and we'll try to get those answered as well.
Yes, that's a great point. You can always send any questions you have in through any of our social media platforms, and we will do our best to make sure to give you the most accurate and timely answers. Thank you.